This week, Lucy O'Brien, author of Lead Sister, The Story of Karen Carpenter, on Karen Carpenter.
Carpenters just stood out as this, they just seemed very straight-laced and Republican. One of the things that really stood out was the fact that Karen played the drums and she sang at the same time. It's a bit of a lethal cocktail, isn't it? Anxiety, perfectionism, and mental health issues and vulnerability to begin with. She was very ill with anorexia. She was really ill. So, yeah, there was the opposition from the record company, but there was also her own failing health at that point. And these things were working against her. She had to kind of suffer and hide it as well, for a long time.
Is it true that she phoned Phil Ramone the day before she died? That interview with Lucy O'Brien is coming up in a second, but just time for me to ask you to like, subscribe, and if you want to see more interviews, go to www.popthehistorymakers.com. Okay, let's get on with the interview with Lucy O'Brien about Karen Carpenter. Well, welcome, Lucy O'Brien, author of...
Sorry.
Bless you. Welcome, Lucy O'Brien, author of Lead Sister, The Story of Karen Carpenter, amongst many other books, of course, but this is the one we're talking about today. Now, the cover of the book shows Karen Carpenter on the drums, and she's wearing a T-shirt, and on this T-shirt are the words Lead Sister. Now, where did the moniker Lead Sister come from, and why for you was this then the perfect title?
In the 70s, I mean, obviously, the Carpenters were absolutely massive in the 70s, and they were really big in Japan as well. And they went to Japan and they were doing an interview with the Japanese magazine, and it was a little bit lost in translation because the author called her the lead sister rather than lead singer. But actually, it turned out that it was the perfect moniker for her, and she loved it so much she put that on a t-shirt, and she wore it for a tour. I think in the late 70s, where she did a huge section where she was playing the drums, and she played a whole raft of drums, and very proudly wore the t-shirt. So I just thought it just really nicely encapsulated her spirit and her approach and her skill.
So when did Karen Carpenter come on your radar as a child? And back then, what did the Carpenters mean to you?
So in the 70s, I was a kid in primary school, and I remember we sang on Top of the World as part of the choir, and I remember the Carpenters being. It felt like they were on Top of the Pops pretty much every week, and they really symbolised to me what what was great about America then. America seemed like this really expansive, amazing, glamorous place with like big fast cars and endless blue skies. And I think the Carpenters really uh yeah, encapsulated that in their music, very lush harmonies, very lush pop. And I was always fascinated by them. And then after her tragically early death, there was this sort of reevaluation of her. Um, and it's a bit like I put in the book, really, about how the Carpenters were a little like a David Lynch film, and that it was this perfect kind of American lush image, and yet real darkness underneath. And I felt that there was a complete reevaluation of her in the 1990s, after the her story came out and her struggle with anorexia. Um, and there was a real appreciation of the Carpenters in a different kind of way. And so I wrote about her in my book She Bop, and I said, in a way, she created her own kind of suburban blues. And that was picked up on by Pete Selby, who really innovated with his 9/8 series of books recently, and he got in touch and said, "Would you like to do a biography of her to coincide with 40 years since her death?" And that was in 2023 that came out.
I mean, I think I really asked the question about what she meant to you, because when we're young, we often identify with a pop star for different reasons. And if I think, my identification figure was Bowie because I was a young gay kid, and Bowie represented a place where I could be myself rather than with my parents. So I just wonder whether that image of the sort of American welcoming perfection was an escape from your own world at that time.
So that's a good question. I think you're absolutely right. I think the UK in the 1970s, yeah, I mean, it could be a bit of a difficult place, and I went to a pretty bad school, yeah, in my primary years, and it just seemed that their kind of sunny pop was an antidote to that, and an escape from that somehow. Um, and then when I became a punk years later, um, there wasn't any, for me, there wasn't any contradiction. Some people criticize the Carpenters as being all sugary and schmaltzy, but I don't think that that's the right understanding of their work. Their music's actually really quite complex, and the harmonies are absolutely incredible. And it's interesting that later on, bands like Sonic Youth really took the Carpenters to their heart, and did some amazing kind of musical tributes to them.
Yeah, I also want to come to
Yeah,
that
yeah.
later. But one thing that was really fascinating is this sort of family dynamic. And Richard, Karen's brother, was often seen as like the chosen one, the first in the family, the one with the talent, through this sort of parental preference. When did that preference exhibit itself, and what effect do you think that had directly on Karen?
Um, yeah, that was from that favoritism was from very early on. And I think it had the effect of kind of erasing Karen in some way, in that their mother, Agnes, clearly thought Richard was the musical one, Richard was the talented genius. Everything had to revolve around Richard. And Karen was sort of in service to that. And I think that was, kind of stunted her growth in some ways, as a woman, and to a certain extent as an artist. And her story is one of fighting to break free of that, essentially, in her own way. Um,
Do you think it's a story of
yeah.
compensation as well? Because I'm going to, my father didn't want a third child. Along came me, and he stayed with my mother, but had nothing to do with me because I suppose I represented the terrible marriage. And I ended up wanting to compensate the lack of love from my father. I end up on MTV, probably to try and get the love from the whole world, but it's bullshit, obviously, and also to get attention. And the fact that Karen was second fiddle in her mother's eyes maybe would be the root for her need for perfection. You know the Brian Wilson story. That's him trying to get his father to appreciate him. And I just wonder whether Karen, her drive was trying to get her mother to love her.
Yes, I do think that there's a lot in that. And that perfectionism, she was driven by a real, very urgent perfectionism. And that was also kind of reflected in a negative way in her eating disorder. So, yeah, these behaviors get entrenched really young. But I also think, looking at the family and researching them in detail, there's also the impact of mental health and issues with mental health, which I think were in the family anyway. So I think there was a vulnerability there in Karen. And it was just unfortunate that her mum was a little cold and detached. And I think that presented problems for Karen going forward. I mean, yes, I think chances for her could have been significantly improved if she'd had a mum who was warm and kind of gave her hugs and affirmed her. Um, but she didn't have that.
I mean, at the start, being a female drummer, and female drummers were few and far between, Viola Smith, Honey Langtree, that made her essentially at the start very cool, didn't it?
Oh yes, and I do remember when I was younger, when they first came out, the Carpenters were written about a lot in the pop press, um, because they were seen as this incredibly talented brother sister duo, and one of the things that really stood out was the fact that Karen played the drums and she sang at the same time, and it was perfectly accepted, and it just seems kind of a little bit disastrous that she was forced to give up the drums, when actually she loved playing drums. She was very skilled at it. It was her thing. In lots of ways, she identified much more with the drums and as a drummer than she did as a singer, even though she was pitch perfect and had this beautiful, warm voice.
When we talk about that era, and maybe it's the same today, but the record industry was definitely almost exclusively male dominated back then. And I just wondered how that male domination of the industry played into the role that she was pushed into.
Yeah, I think Karen was definitely advised, shall we say, by her brother Richard, by her management, by the record company to, as they put it, stand out from behind the drums, lose the drums, kind of front it, because that was the model of success. That if you have a female lead singer, um, in a sense, she sells the music, she sells the romance. Um, and
But also in that era, she doesn't, I'm not specifically talking about Karen Carpenter, but in that era, female singers don't write the songs. They aren't part of the publishing, you know.
yes, yes, yeah. I mean, in lots of ways, the 1970s music industry was incredibly male, and driven, in a way that excluded women and excluded women as creators, as songwriters, as having agency, basically. But you see, that's what I find so remarkable about Karen Carpenter's story, how she just kind of pushed on regardless. Um, and she was there in the studio 24/7 with Richard, contributing to the production, co-production credits on some of the albums, and then also the architect of a lot of those vocal arrangements as well. So I really wanted to look at, she's been portrayed a lot as this fragile victim, but I thought to really achieve what she achieved in the 1970s in that kind of environment, she had to be pretty gutsy.
I mean, your book is one of a number of sort of tipping points about the legacy of Karen Carpenter. And one of the first ones I watched last night was the Todd Haynes film Superstar, which is actually on YouTube, which is why it's brilliant sometimes.
Yes,
And and that was the first one really to sort of shine a light
yes.
on her legacy. So tell me from your perspective about Superstar and the importance of that in starting to change this legacy.
Oh, it was crucial, and I was lucky enough to see. I remember seeing it in its glory. In It was in a cinema off Russell Square, and I was so struck by it. I mean, it was an animation, it was animated Barbie. Well, not Barbie dolls. Some of them were Barbie dolls, but they've been like completely modified. Um, and It was just a brilliant way to tell a really dark story. And it was so innovative. And it just made me think about the Carpenters in a completely different way. And it was kind of absorbing. So, we're talking early 1980s. So it was absorbing a lot of critiques around feminism, also identity, sexuality. it was exploring all those things in this amazing, quite audacious animation.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly powerful. And you mentioned Sonic Youth earlier, and of course, Kim Gordon wrote in her memoir, Girl in a Band, the only autonomy Karen felt she had in her life, she accepted over her body. She was an extreme version of what a lot of women suffer from, a lack of control over things other than their bodies, which turns the female body into a tool for power, good, bad, or ugly. As a woman, was this something that you could have a greater understanding of and thus connect you even closer to Karen Carpenter writing this book?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think Kim Gordon's song "Tunic" really captures that. And a lot of us growing up around that time, in our teens and 20s, there was a new awareness about eating disorders, about anorexia, a condition that had been kind of shrouded in mystery for a long time or misunderstood. Um, and yet there were so many young women and men as well suffering from it. Um, and I suppose it was during the 80s, that 80s and 90s, that was the first time that there was a real reevaluation of that, uh, and channeled through an understanding of Karen Carpenter and her story.
So, how do you feel you've added to the reframing then of the image, the legacy of Karen Carpenter?
Well, it means an awful lot to me, and it's kind of at the core of my work, really, in that it follows a template that I did with Dusty, my book Dusty, where the more I looked into her story, and I did a lot of interviews, I did a lot of real in-depth research, the more I could see, hang on a minute, she actually really co-produced a lot of that music and arranged a lot of that music, but wasn't credited with it. Um, and the same with Karen. I could. It was like almost a little bit of detective work, and by talking to musicians who were there in the room, who were there in the studio with her, I got this very rounded 3D picture of who she was as a musician and an artist and how much she actually contributed. And, that goes into the work that I've done in all kinds of ways with like She Bop as well. My book about women in history of women in popular music. It's about kind of uncovering those hidden stories and the hidden histories and kind of finding and giving women the recognition they deserve.
What did the people that you interview then say specifically about, let's say, her drumming and her voice?
Say an example, Cubby O'Brien, who was kind of hired as a drummer to, um, when she was encouraged to step away from the drums, she struck this agreement with the management. Look, okay, I'll sing lead on the ballads, but as long as I can carry on playing drums on other songs. So what they did was they brought the drummer Cubby O'Brien onto tours, and I spoke to him at length about, and he said that she was a really fantastic drummer, and that she was really influenced by a lot of the same people that he was influenced by, some of those great 50s jazz drummers. Um, and he said that they had such a rapport together. So that's one example of her drum playing. And then talking to, so if sort of fast forward to 1979 when she was in New York and she was recording her solo album, I spoke to a lot of the musicians and producers who were working on that album. Um, and they all talked in detail about her contributions and what she was doing in the studio, in for instance, crafting her vocal arrangements and really steering a lot of the song choices and the style. and just working in collaboration with the musicians.
I mean, one thing that is really fascinating is that Richard was the lead, and then when that didn't work out, Karen becomes the singer. And, we talked about Karen being seen as second best in the mother's eyes, but how
Mm.
difficult must it have been for Richard to be the chosen one and then not able to live completely up to the promise of that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it must have been. It must have been a point of tension. It must have been difficult um, because he knew in his heart of hearts he didn't really have the voice. I mean, he could sing and he could harmonize, but he wasn't really a lead singer, and he knew that. Um, and also drumming wasn't necessarily his thing. Um, so in lots of ways, it was much more of a collaboration than was, for so long he was presented as the genius and the whole architect of the Carpenters sound. Um, and you know, that's not fair. That's not a fair evaluation. And I think he knew deep down that that wasn't a fair evaluation.
Did you approach him for the book?
I did, yes. I sent a couple of emails via his PR and out of courtesy as much as anything else to explain the project and what I was doing and that I really would like to interview him. He politely declined. He had a book coming out while I was researching it, and it was a book almost like I guess a collection of photos and flyers and like a coffee table book of the Carpenters, and it included lots of fantastic detail about all their tours and their tour schedules, which was extremely useful for me.
I
But yeah,
mean,
go back to yeah. In a way, I didn't mind the fact that he declined to be interviewed because and it's not just with the lead sister, but other books. I've like say my Madonna book. In the end, she declined to authorize it, even though she wasn't opposed to it. It's just that if someone authorizes the book, then it becomes their book essentially. And it's not my book, and then it takes away my freedom to um, yeah, write in the way that I want and reflect in the way that I want.
Lucy O'Brien also gave me a little update about Madonna. And if you click the link, you can see it there. Okay, let's get back to the interview with Lucy about Karen Carpenter. But don't forget, please like and subscribe. It does seem that they both had some form of control issues. I was reading something in the web today that said that Richard was a very controlling person. And he did write many of the songs, as you mentioned, with John Bettis.
Yeah,
So in that sense, he did have some control.
yes,
And with Karen, it was almost like she was fighting for control, and anorexia is sort of a
yeah,
control issue, isn't it?
most definitely. I find it astonishing that you know, she said in an interview at one point, I wish Richard would tell me what songs we're going to sing. He doesn't tell me what songs we're going to sing. And this is even before, like maybe even the day before they're going in the studio. And I think that's nuts. And that is such a controlling strategy, isn't it? Because singers like to prepare, of course. You have to prepare.
But
So
also someone that was very anxious from what you've written. So, if she had severe anxiety and she doesn't even know what's coming the next day.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, that said a lot to me. And the fact that when she um said to him, "Oh, I'm going to record a solo album," he said, "Whatever you do, don't do disco." Um, and what I love is that, yeah, that's obviously she went and experimented with disco because she loved the new kind of funky sounds that were coming out of New York.
Was there also an external trigger for her anorexia in the sense that, you know, like the pressures you have of being a singer, being on camera, you know, and even when I was on MTV, someone told me, you know, you need to lose weight. So there's always a trigger, and that can really flip people
Yeah.
completely.
So just out of interest, what effect did it have on you when someone said that?
I went out and I got caught by the boss in McDonald's, which I don't even know, because what it made me do was go out and eat
Yeah.
because it was the comfort. I needed that comfort from
Yeah.
being told that I'm overweight.
Did it make you feel anxious?
Um, yes, absolutely, because I
Mm.
felt I was under threat in terms of my job,
Yes.
you know, because of my physicality.
Yes. So absolutely. If you could imagine Karen's feeling then, and probably times 10, because she was a woman and because of the level of exposure at that point with the number one hits that they were having. I mean, it's mind blowing, really, when you think about it. I mean, I would find that absolutely intolerable just for myself. Um, and so if you kind of put that, it's a bit of a lethal cocktail, isn't it? You know, anxiety, perfectionism, and mental health issues and vulnerability to begin with, you
Well,
know.
and the isolation that follows, because I
Yes,
think, you know, and I remember someone at university that I knew and was definitely anorexia, and anybody that tried to help in any way just meant she became very isolated. It didn't
yes,
help.
yes. And I think that's what's very poignant. You know, some of the people it, what was good about doing the book, you know, in some ways it was frustrating and sad because a lot of the potential interviewees had passed away. You know, this was 40 years ago. Um, but having said that, the people that were who wanted to be interviewed for the book and were really happy to be interviewed were people like Rebecca Siegel, who was her tour manager in the 70s, and also Tom Barler, who was her boyfriend in the 70s. And these were two people who'd never really spoken before. But because enough time has elapsed, they felt they could be frank and they felt they could really open up about exactly those issues to do with Karen's eating disorder and her anorexia. So it gave me a lot of insight into what was happening at that point. And exactly as you say, how isolated Karen was. And what's really sad is that she was struggling with this on her own. Um, and we now know that in order to treat anorexia, you need like a full team. You need the inpatient treatment, the outpatient treatment. You, you know, this is a life-threatening condition that requires a massive team, really. And she didn't have any of it. She didn't have any of it, and she had to kind of suffer and hide it as well for a long time.
I mean, they came up during an era which was after the sort of protest, you know, era. Well, it was during the protest era, really, and also the Vietnam War, and you've got Nixon in the White House, and um, and then representing sort of a very perfectionist, perfect side of America. And then they make a sort of massive, I suppose you call it today, a sort of PR disaster. They get invited by Nixon to the White House. How did that play with the public in America that was into music?
Yeah, it didn't go down too well. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? America has always been very dualistic, you know, in the sense that her fans, their fans included a lot of middle America, a lot of people driven by Republican, quite not unlike today when you see the Christian the very strong kind of evangelical Christian element and that was part of their fan base. I think in America particularly, that set up tension, and that's, Claire Barron, who worked at A&M Records, said, at A&M Records, there were a lot of rock acts and kind of alternative acts, and the Carpenters just stood out as this, they just seemed very straight-laced and Republican, and she said most of us in A&M were Democrats, and then there was this Republican band, or seemingly, appealing to President Nixon, and seemingly very conservative. So I think it created, and it was more in the American market, it created this sense of, I think for a long time, the Carpenters were seen as very middle of the road, very conservative, and were looked down upon really by the rock and punk um, fraternity.
I mean, were her final years compounded by this sort of growing lack of interest in the band?
Yeah. I mean, she was very competitive, and she could see their audience beginning to ebb away, by the late 70s. Partly because by then punk was really coming in, disco had was revolutionizing the music industry, and she was so conscious of wanting to innovate and wanting to um, kind of give the Carpenters an overhaul, I guess. Um, uh, and I think that's why she went into a much more kind of funky direction when it came to her solo album.
Yeah, I mean, that came about because Richard went into rehab, didn't he? Because he liked to get high. And I
Yes,
suppose he got too high. And then
yes,
he
yes,
goes off into rehab.
yes.
And she does something which feels like, as you sort of mentioned, feels like could be the resurrection and the actual making of her.
Oh, yes,
First of all,
yes.
tell me about that album and who was involved in it and how invested she was.
Yeah. So one of the kind of most frustrating things about it, and having talked to the musicians working on it, she did some work with Rod Temperton, Mr. Boogie Nights man, who who worked also with Michael Jackson, but before that, he wrote for and had for her the songs "Rock with You" and also "Off the Wall," and you just think, oh my God, if she'd had those songs, because part of the reason A&M rejected her solo album was they said there were no hits on it. So if she'd had those two, that would have been it. She'd have been that would have launched her solo career in exactly the way she wanted and envisaged. Um, it's sad though, because by then she was very ill with anorexia. She was really ill. So yeah, there was the opposition from the record company, but there was also her own failing health at that point, and these things were working against her.
Is it true that she phoned Phil Ramone the day before she died?
Yes, she did. She did. She literally, the day before she died, and she said, "We made an effing great record, didn't we?" She knew she'd made a great record. It really stands up now as, uh, and I've sort of written about this in the book, as a definitive female soul statement. And it's subtle and it's nuanced, and she knew what she was doing.
I mean, it's so poignant that that is the day before she died. So it was
Yes,
absolutely, at the front of her mind,
yes,
which could have been her freedom. It could have been
yes,
the moment.
yes, yes.
One of the strangest stories around her was her marriage.
Yeah,
And it seems to be bizarre, as if she fell into something because she wanted, I mean, this is my interpretation of it, but it's not, that she wanted to be loved because she made, in a sense, a terrible choice and didn't know anything about the man.
sorry, I can't remember his name. Tom.
Thomas James Burris, he was an estate agent, wasn't
Yeah,
he?
yeah, Tom Borrow. That's right, estate agent. Um, yes, so it was a very strange choice. And I spoke to her boyfriend Tom Barler about this because he was kind of the boyfriend before Tom Burris. And Tom Barler said and kind of opened up talking about how Karen's mum um, was suspicious of Tom Barler, partly because he had a daughter from another relationship. And she was afraid that if Tom and Karen got married, that the daughter would want some of the money. It's very this word transactional comes up a lot in in the current political climate, but transactional was certainly partly Agnes Carpenter's way of looking at the world. Um, Tom Barler said to me, and it's ironic that Karen should then go for a guy like Tom Burris, this real estate developer, kind of arch Republican, clearly kind of on the make, and that she should fall for someone like that who just seemed to be interested in her money. And I think it also showed Karen's vulnerability, and that by then she really wasn't very well. She wasn't making the best decisions. She desperately wanted love and to settle down and be married. But it just seems to me by then she was kind of drifting in and out of the real world, and she wasn't making the best decisions.
I mean, he had a 19-year-old son and he'd had a vasectomy, so he couldn't have
Mm.
children. And
Yeah,
these are things that, she found out afterwards.
yeah, yes, yes,
And you mentioned, just then about love and, maybe just wanting to be loved. And there is a person who's internally trying to get the love from her mother,
mm,
looking for the love from a man who hasn't told her the truth.
yes.
But yet the gift she had was to transport these songs, which are often about love, in the most beautiful way. That's not a coincidence, is it?
Yeah. No, it and I interviewed another one of her former boyfriends, Nicky Chin, who said that, he felt that she channeled a lot of that angst and that sadness into her songs, and that in some ways it was quite cathartic for her. And I think that's why people respond to those songs because there's this deep resonance there, for sure.
Yeah, I
Um,
think it's often that we have the same sort of pain going on in
yeah,
some way that the artists that we love have, and that's why they can transport those songs to us through their pain.
yeah, yeah,
Well, the end of the book is about you going to the studio
yeah.
and getting some sort of feeling for what it must have been like and for Karen's voice. Can you tell me about that and how that affected you?
Yeah, it was uncanny. It was really uncanny. So I went to LA. This was towards the end of researching the book, and I went with the express purpose of tracking down interviewees and and speaking to people and doing a lot of that kind of head research. Um, and then after a while, it was almost like something in me was saying, "Look, just relax, just soak up the atmosphere." Um, and so I kind of went on this, and I write about it at the end of the book. It was almost like I was taken on this kind of psychological journey. And I went to all the places where she had lived, like in Downey, where she grew up, um, and also where she'd lived in Century City, this really glitzy apartment. And while I was walking around, it was at certain points, it was almost like I was hearing her voice just coming in. Like when we were in Downey, she said, "This is where I first felt really depressed." Um, and then when I was walking near Century City, she said, "Yeah, I was so happy here. I had the time of my life. I was on top of the world." Um, and then I went to Henson Recording Studios, as it is now, which is the A&M recording studios where the Carpenters recorded all their hits. And they've kept the studios pretty much as they were since the 70s. And as a result, it feels so atmospheric. And the engineer who was showing me round, I spent quite a lot of time there. He said, you can feel her spirit, you can feel her there. And it was quite late at night, and they like I'd gone into Studio B where they recorded Song for You, and I sat there and I was listening to it coming over the speakers, and it was so uncanny hearing the song in the same space that it was recorded. It was like an echo of an echo, and it was the strangest thing. I kind of felt suddenly she was singing, and it was like she was singing to me. This is a song for you, and it was almost like she's saying that you've got to get this. You've got to get this for the book. It's about the music. It's about the music. If you can get that and you can convey that, then you've got me. And it felt so personal, and it was quite amazing actually. And so I went back home, kind of taking, I hoped, some of that atmosphere with me, and putting that in the book.
Oh, it's really beautiful. Thank you, Lucy O'Brien. Thanks for talking about your book, Lead Sister, The Story of Karen Carpenter. And I want to thank you in the end because, particularly you write books which give another perspective into the people that have enriched our lives through their music. So thank you.
Thank you.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.